The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Give ear to our prayers, O Lord, and direct the way of your servants in safety under your protection, that amid all the changes of our earthly pilgrimage, we may be guarded by your mighty aid. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. All right, before we get started, let's give a round of applause to Doug Eskew and his crew. Thank you, Alexander, for giving a round of applause. And be sure to thank them as you're heading out before you leave today. I would say, tip your, put some tips in the tip jar, but I don't think we have a tip jar. It's a good thing, probably. Will you take some? Okay, well, you can pass it around. And I'm sure people will give generously. All right, today we are going to try to catch up with everything I tried to slam into 40 minutes last week and move ourselves into discussing our topic, which is the devil and Satan, past the post-exilic Jewish period. I'm sure all of you went home and pulled out text and Googled post-exilic, Second Temple, all that stuff. First Enoch. I'm sure you're just all Enoch up now. Well, hold on to the idea of Enoch, because Enoch's going to pop back up, which is going to prove there was some real purpose to my trying to slog you into some weird deuterocanonical Jewish text last week, because he's going to have an impact we're going to find out as we go through our class today. Today we are studying... Oh, that says class 2. I forgot to put another line in. Class 3 is the devil in the New Testament. And I feel like it's probably best before to just sort of look at where we are. Anybody know where that picture comes from? It's called the Devil's Bible. It's got another title to it. It's not the Devil's Bible. It's an old monastic text that just they went a little wild drawing a picture of the devil. And I think it's really giant. It's like a huge text. It's called I can't remember. See, I should have studied before I started this class, but that's where the weird, scary picture comes from. But I think, as I've already mentioned, the word the devil comes to us in the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is the Greek text of the Old Testament. And when we get into the New Testament, that is any quotes from the Old Testament tend to come from the Greek Septuagint. And the word diabolos, which again, if I was speaking good Spanish, what would it be? Diablo. But it's diabolos or something along those lines in the Greek, which gives us the term that's translated into English as the devil. Thus Satan, who we've been talking about, Hasatan, as it comes from the Hebrew, is mentioned in the New Testament nearly 3 times more than in the Hebrew Bible. I said this one. In the New Testament, which was originally written entirely in Koine Greek, Hasatan is usually translated as diabolos, which, when translated in English, is most frequently translated as devil. Hasatan also is, and that probably is what I'm going to say next, but I can't remember, so I'll just say it anyway. Hasatan also becomes a proper name when we get into the New Testament. Did I say that? No. Well, yeah, I do. That's the bottom. Diabolos is translated as the devil and as Satan in English over 60 times, and almost always as a proper name. So the difference in that is simply a descriptive noun. Remember, Hasatan means the accuser or the adversary. When we get into the New Testament, we've moved through that apocalyptic period. And remember, all that craziness last week had a purpose to it. There's a beginning point to the Jewish people beginning to try to sort out what evil has to do with life in our world under God's creation. This leads them into facing one of the greatest moments in their existence, which is the exile to Babylon. It's in the Babylonian period that they begin to write about apocalyptic views of what's going to happen. How is the world going to end? What has brought about this evil? And this is when they begin to dig back into the text and begin to recognize things in a different way. And the different way is that there are a variety of rebellious spiritual entities that have come into resistance and into a fall, not too unlike our own human fall in our rebellion against God in the story of Adam and Eve. All of that is to get us to where we come when we get to the New Testament, when we've come through the evolution period and we've landed on a space. And that is that all of those other images of evil, whether they were spiritual angels, remember I think we talked about the Malach. If we didn't, we talked about the B'nai Elohim who had fallen in rebellion. All of those are beginning to take one shape, one character, one being. It's an understanding of evil in the way of Satan. And that goes back to Job, where the Ha-Satan name comes from. And it'll eventually go all the way back to the beginning of creation and Adam and Eve and the serpent. And we're going to see that in the New Testament a lot more than we see it in the Old Testament, which is why it appears so many times. But before we get into Diabolos and Ha-Satan, and Satan, we should look at where the place of the evil one will go. If you remember last week when we talked about first Enoch and we talked about the angels in rebellion, we said they were placed down in chains into the earth. Well, most of you who've done Bible study probably already know the concept of Sheol. Sheol being a place for the fades, the spirits, where people go when they die in a way that is not quite any place of happiness or joy or heaven or hell. In the Jewish idea of Sheol, it's their answer to the Hellenistic Greek idea of Hades, a place of the dead being in general. These are important places. It's this little term in the middle called Gehenna that will begin to shape the difference in the two. I should do my bullet points before I talk, because I'm probably going to say all the same thing twice. In the Septuagint, the Jewish Sheol, a place originally thought to be a place for both the righteous and the unrighteous dead, is usually translated into Greek as Hades. So in the Septuagint, it doesn't say Sheol. In the Hebrew text, it says Sheol. But in the Greek text, they didn't have a Greek word for Sheol, so they just simply used the word they understood and knew, which was Hades as a place for the dead. Jesus speaks of both Hades, which is his understanding of Sheol, as well as a place called Gehenna, literally the valley of Hinnom, as a place of the devil and of punishment. So again, we just crossed over from the Jewish period of understanding the dead, going to this underworld of the dead in general, to a place that begins to be a place of punishment, which in the understanding of the Jewish mind could easily be connected with a place called Gehenna. Gehenna actually existed just outside of Jerusalem, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's not too far from Jerusalem today. And it is a place that will eventually get translated from Greek into English as hell, because it'll be a place more punishment. That's anything next? Let's see. These two places will maintain some degree of separation early on, but will soon meld into one unified identity as hell, a place of the dead for those who are not going to heaven. So that's the key piece. The Jewish understanding of those who die and are dead. There is no real afterlife. I'm sure you've heard a sermon or a priest or a Bible or an EFM class that told you about the fact that there was no, in early Judaism, there wasn't really an understanding of any place after death. That begins to develop when Jews come into contact with the Greeks, and it develops beyond that. But it's only after that apocalyptic period that we begin to see a place where the dead, there's only two places the dead can go. They're either going to go to heaven or they're going to go into punishment in hell. So Hades and Sheol are not heaven. So therefore they begin to get understood in Christianity simply as hell. The emergence of the idea of purgatory will mark the return of Hades to Christian understanding. Purgatory, it's a whole, I don't even know why I put that in there, because that'd be a whole other class to teach. Where does the idea of purgatory come from? Well, all of us Episcopalians have told you that we're not Catholics, so therefore this understanding of some in-between place doesn't really exist in our reading of the Bible. And it's not in Scriptures even for those good Catholics, so they might point to 1st or 2nd Maccabees as a place to find some reference to the righteous dead going somewhere other than to heaven. But the understanding of purgatory has a whole lot to do with trying to figure out what limbo is and all that. It is tied to the next topic, though, which is the topic of the harrowing of hell. So if there's any understanding of what a mid-place might be, so the transition from Hades and Sheol, two places where the dead go, to heaven and hell, heaven and Gehenna, a place of torment and a place of heavenly closeness to God. It comes out of this idea of how the early church made sense of what happened to the prophets of old. So, I'm already way off track into the deep, muddy waters. So let me see if I can pull out of the muddy waters here. See, I could have just talked about Diabolos and been a lot easier than this. The harrowing of hell, though, is an interesting piece because we say it every time we say which creed? The Apostles' Creed. We say Jesus died, He descended into hell, is right one, because again, in the early church, there was no in-between, so He had to go somewhere. He went to hell. Now in Rite 2, we say He descended to the dead, which is a restoration of a bit of Hellenistic Hades, a bit of a place somewhere that isn't about torment, because the people He goes to save should not have been tormented, because who would Jesus need to go down into the underworld to pull out of the underworld on Holy Saturday? Who? Moses, Elijah, all the prophets, Amos, Hezekiah, David, all of these people that had to go somewhere before Jesus came into the world. That's what the harrowing hell will be all about, which again I probably already said in one of these bullet points. Harrowing hell is understood as, from the Bible by the early church, found in the Apostles' Creed, as we already said, is the best example of the fusing of the Greek idea of Hades and the Christian understanding of hell. Are there biblical references to the harrowing of hell? It would appear so. 1 Peter 3:18 through 19 says, He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which also He went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison. So again, going back to who might these spirits in prison be? Well, who do we talk about being in prison last week in the Enoch text? These rebellious angels. So obviously there was a place where souls or these spiritual beings went to. And so as the early church tried to make sense of the time before Jesus, they decided that there needed to be some way for Jesus to go and restore all of those who'd been before Him. So this becomes the image of the harrowing of hell. Yes, you certainly can't help me.
No, yeah. But, okay, we've seen that song, Rock My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. Was there not another, I grew up thinking that those people were already in a special place, but not in a place like Gehenna.
Yeah. Well,
where did we get that? Did we just make that up because we wanted to believe that?
That probably comes after when the Protestant Reformation comes. Okay. A lot of this stuff is cast out. I tell a story somewhere in my past about going to a Methodist funeral and digging through the back of the Methodist hymnal. If you do the back of the Methodist hymnal, you'll find prayers that are very similar, if not taken directly from the Book of Common Prayer. You can find their copy of the Apostles' Creed, and it will have an option for removing that line about descending to the dead. Because again, they just asked the same question you asked, and they're probably the ones who wrote that song. That they're in the bosom of Abraham, they've already been taken up. These are God's chosen people. Why would they be anywhere else?
He was taken up.
Well, there are some, Elijah and Moses, when we get to Jude, I'm going to show you where the early church even started wondering about this too. Because there's a reference in the letter of Jude that talks about Michael and Satan arguing over the body of Moses. We have no text that reference that at all. But it's there, I think, because they could not send Moses anywhere else other than up to be with God. Elijah was taken up to be with God. Who does Jesus meet at the moment of the Transfiguration? Moses and Elijah. But we're talking about all the rest of those good souls. And honestly, the way to look at it is the early church really struggling, trying to make sense of having been Jews for thousands of years and suddenly becoming Christians, following Jesus the Messiah, and trying to make sense of what this new faith said. And their understanding was, how do they make sense of all those people? Forget the great saints like the prophets I mentioned, but just your own grandmother or something. So Jesus goes down on Holy Saturday to pull all those souls out. And the early church will also say this is a really good example of what Jesus was doing from the very beginning in the story of the resurrection, which is this little scary dude underneath the door, right? That's Jesus knocking the door down and stepping on Satan. So it's that idea that Jesus has already won the battle, and now he's going right into the pit of hell to pull these souls out. Sorry, Alexander, you've had your hand up forever.
Well, how about the story of Lazarus and the rich man? Lazarus was,
Yeah.
and the rich man wanted Lazarus to come down, and yet Lazarus couldn't cross the
He was
line.
already up in the bosom of Abraham. I know. So this is a good example of the church trying to struggle through. And I've always said, and I know some of you have heard me say this, but I love the Apostles' Creed in the Right One version when it says he descended into hell. Not because I want to wonder like the early church did about where hell was and what he was going down to do, but I love the powerful preaching story of Jesus being willing to go all the way to hell to save us. That's the greater image of the harrowing of hell, is that Jesus loves us so much, he went down to preach to the dead, is what 1st and 2nd Peter will say. Why would Jesus do that? Because he's willing to go fix what happened before him, is the way the early church makes sense of it. And we all know if it's in Scripture, they're going to make sense. We just spent a whole time last week talking about 1st Enoch, which is those 3 little dots between these angels having a fun time with human women, and then Noah and the ark story. And something happened in between, and they created a whole understanding of it that impacts Christianity. And in some ways, and I'm not going to show you all these because I, as usual, have put way too many in here, but these texts from the canonical Bible. Here is Ephesians. Therefore it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive. He gave gifts to his people. When it says he ascended, what does it mean? But that he had also descended into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended in the same one is the same one who ascended far above all the heavens so that he might fill all things. This is the early church reading the letter to the Ephesians and trying to sort out what it means he descended into the lower parts of the earth. And because it's in the Bible, they're going to take it seriously and try to sort that out. I think this is the 1st Peter reading. If it is, I'll just skip over that one too. Maybe that was what it was. But this is 1 Peter 4, verses 5 through 6. But they will have to give an accounting to him who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that though they had been judged in the flesh, as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. This is a direct scriptural passage that the early church will say is speaking about the harrowing of hell. When did Jesus in the gospel go preach to the dead? We don't hear that at all. They asked the same question. It must have been on Holy Saturday when he went down to deal with those who had been judged in the flesh, just as everyone else is judged, that they might live in the spirit as God does. So again, to me, it's a wonderful preaching message of Jesus loving his creation, or God loving his creation so much that God goes down to the dead to pull them out of Sheol and take them up to be with him. There's another great text that Hans von Balthasar, is my favorite 21st century Catholic theologian, taught. He used this as a symbol of the harrowing of hell, which I found to be interesting. I hadn't read it that way. I'll just throw it out there and then we'll move on. Mark chapter 3, verses 22 through 27. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebul, another name for a demonic figure. Beelzebul is something that was worshipped in 2 Kings, which becomes, in the Jewish period at the time of Jesus, another symbol of a demonic being. And by the ruler of the demons, he cast out demons. And Jesus called them to him and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? And this is one of those situations where he's not using diabolos, he's using satanas. So this is the first example of Jesus using a proper name for Satan, which is translated appropriately thusly. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Hans von Balthasar will read this and say, Jesus is giving a forecast of his own harrowing of hell. He is going to trick the devil, to think the devil is playing against the devil's self. What? Because Jesus is going to die on the cross. Satan feels like he's won the battle. But the house is going to fall because death can't work in that same way against God, which means that the strong man, that's Satan's house. No one can enter the strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. So again, this is a Catholic scholar in the 20th century reading an ancient parable of Jesus and saying, this is a sign that Jesus tied up the strong man, who is Satan, so that he could go into his house and plunder it. What's he plundering? The souls of those who died before the death of Jesus. So that's the image of the harrowing of hell. And I think it's an interesting one to think about, especially now when you say the Apostles' Creed, you can think about me talking about Satanas, if you want to. Here's some images, because the church is full of some great architecture. I think this is from Chartres or one of the French cathedrals. But another example of Jesus and the harrowing of hell, going in. I love how he's always beating down Satan under his feet, from the Great Litany. Another image of Jesus coming in. This is the strong man who's bound, which is the devil. And then one more image of a little later period with some really spooky looking demons and devils in it there. But it's the same thing. The door is being broken down into the strong man's house to plunder it of the souls of those who came before, which more than likely, I always guess this is Adam and Eve. I don't know. It could be somebody else, but that's a good sign, isn't it? Let's look at Jesus and the devil and see all the many times that Jesus references the devil. Jesus is tempted by Satan in the wilderness in all three synoptic gospels. Jeannie had the least of those to preach on, because in Mark, there's not much told to us about Jesus being in the wilderness for 40 days and being tempted by the devil. But it happens in all three of the synoptics, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus performs exorcisms of devils and demons throughout the Gospels. I'm going to give you an example of one of those in a minute, and we can talk about exorcism all you want. The parable of the seed and the sower includes a reference to the devil. That's one of my favorite parables. When he goes out and sows the seeds, and some of it falls on the roadside, some falls amongst the thorns. You know the story. Jesus refers to the devil as a murderer from the beginning in the Gospel of John, chapter 8. From the beginning is possibly a beginning reference of Jesus beginning to understand the serpent in the Adam and Eve story as being the murderer from the beginning, being the devil, versus just the serpent. Jesus seems to speak of witnessing Satan's fall from heaven, echoing Isaiah 14, saying, I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. This again, we'll talk a little bit about this. I don't know if I have all the time. I'd like to talk about it, but it's a really interesting story. Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 will become texts that will be very important to Christians about understanding this story of the fall of Satan. And Jesus seems to reference it when he talks about watching Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. In Matthew's scene of the final judgment, Jesus divides the sheep into the goats, sending the latter to the eternal fire prepared for Satan and his angels, a reference to Satan and his angels. Again, you don't get much of the devil and his angels in the Old Testament if you don't read 1 Enoch. The Gospels will also state that it is the devil who enters Judas and leads him in his betrayal of Jesus. Let's look really quickly at the story of the temptation. We won't have to read all of this because you've heard it all before, but it's Jesus in the story. This is from John's Gospel. No, it's not from John's Gospel. This is from Luke's Gospel. I didn't change it. I apologize. Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. This is the use of the diabolos word. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, that's how we're in the season we're in, he was hungry. Well, Jesus made 40 days and 40 nights, and then he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. And he answered, it is written, Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him up to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone. Jesus said again, It is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, All these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said, Begone, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. So a good example of regular temptations: food, power over death, and worldly powers and strengths. These are the temptations Jesus Himself goes through, which is very important for us because all of us face them as well. And of course the idea of Jesus being fully human and fully divine is that He lives and understands our human struggle. And this is a good example of Him going face to face with the devil. Good images of this. I can't remember where this one comes from, but it's probably the late 19th century or early 20th. This one is from Venice, Italy. One of those really pretty cathedrals. What's it called? San Marco, perhaps. Maybe. But this is an image that holds all of them, with the devil being his usual little self with the horns and the dark wings. And he's tempting Jesus with the bread, taking Jesus to the top of the pinnacle, taking Jesus up to the top where the riches are. You can see them there. And then Jesus says, Away with you, Satan, and the angels come to tend to him. Again, this is a long one. Let's just say that the story of exorcism is throughout the New Testament. We in our 21st century minds will see it always and tend to immediately go to the one thing we go to all the time to deal with evil. That is mental health issues or some sort of mental health sickness. Some of those make sense when you read the New Testament. Some of them are not quite that easy. This one of the demoniac of the Gerasenes is an interesting one because this is someone who's been bound, as it says, a man with an unclean spirit. Where is it? It's up there somewhere. There it is. Unclean spirit. Thank you. And then it says that he's been wandering around in the tombs. And it gives us this example that he's been bound and shackled with chains, but he's able to wrench the chains apart, and he broke the shackles into pieces. No one had strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. So a terrible image of this possession by the unclean spirit. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out loud with a loud voice, he said, What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me. So an interesting moment of demons using the name of God to get Jesus to stay away from them. I have read some good texts that talk about Jesus coming in is a meeting of the old times in which there was more power of evil over the world and the new world that Jesus is bringing in, and this is the transition point of it. And Jesus says, For he was saying to him, Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And Jesus asked him, What is your name? Very powerful. Once you get the name of someone, you have the power. That's why the name of God, which is Yahweh, is not said by the Orthodox Jews because it's too powerful to say these names. Jesus demands the name of the demon, who says, My name is Legion, for we are many. And eventually we, at the end of the story, where they don't want to be sent out to a different country. This is their area, so they come up with a great plan to go into these pigs, which is interesting to think of. Where is the Gerasene? It can't be in the real Jewish world because there wouldn't be a whole slew of pigs in the Jewish community. But Jesus says, sure, go enter into the pigs. And when they enter into the pigs get wild and run over a cliff, and they all meet their doom as they drown in the midst of the sea. So that what happens next, and we'll just leave it at that, is that the herdsmen go and tell about what Jesus has done, and they're all so frightened when they see this man who's been living among the tombs, wearing regular clothes and in the right mind, that they want Jesus to go away. That's how frightened they are that Jesus has been there. Which is a really interesting twist to a story if you read the Bible. Like, well, it's all set up to give us these great stories of Jesus. Every now and then they don't make a whole lot of sense. The man goes and wants to go with Jesus, who's lost the unclean spirit, the demoniac, as he's called. And Jesus tells him to go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. Which, of course, Jesus is always saying in Mark's Gospel, don't talk about me, talk about God. Of course, the person goes, I'm sure, to the Decapolis, 10 cities there in that area, to tell them about Jesus, I'm sure. So images of exorcism are throughout the early church, and they look nearly as scary as the movies do today in some respects. Demonic spirits being cast out. Last but not least, what did I say here? This is the seed. We'll just skip over that because I know you all know the story, but there is a reference there to the devil coming and collecting seeds. It's powerful because I think it fits quite well with our own struggles with God's Word. Sometimes we take it, sometimes we get distracted, sometimes it falls on good soil and takes root. This is Jesus' reference to these Jewish scribes, and he says, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, so this is that reference, and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. So this is a passage in John's Gospel that gives us the understanding of how far the devil has come by the time of Jesus, because Jesus understands him to be the father of lies, which is a powerful image. I don't know if this is from that story or not, but I thought it was an interesting image. I don't think Jesus is in here, but you can certainly see the devil there leading and controlling these men. Again, I've been trying to talk about this for 2 sessions, 706. Let me just give you a quick overview of it, and I'll fly on by. This is important because it has 2 passages from the Old Testament that connect to the way Christians see Satan. And I'll just run through these and skip the readings to go with it. From the beginning, Christians have pointed to Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, this important text in the foretelling and understanding of Satan, though Jewish scholars continue to read the text differently. Remember last week I told you that most of the writings about the devil come from the Second Temple period. Well, Ezekiel and Isaiah are somewhere in that line, but nobody ever points to Isaiah and Ezekiel specifically as post-exilic period writers, definitely not so much apocalyptic. So it's weird to think that Christians read those texts and see something within it. But let's see what we read when we read this, and I think you'll understand if you see where we come from as a church in the understanding of this apocalyptic understanding of good and evil, of light and darkness, and the battle of Jesus for the souls of the world. Isaiah 14 says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star," which comes from the Greek word phosphorus, or in Latin translates as Lucifer, the other name, son of dawn. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. So it sounds to me like it's talking about the devil. Ezekiel 28 says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings. So I brought out fire from within you. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth. Again, if you read this, understanding the story of the fall of angels and the story of the devil, that seems to be talking about the devil. You were in Eden, the garden of God. and I cast you as profane thing from the mountain of God. What's interesting is what reads like the devil in the text is addressed by the prophets to earthly kings. Isaiah 14:4 says, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. So, old Daystar, son of dawn, is, according to the text, if you read the prophet Isaiah, about the king of Babylon, not about the devil. While Ezekiel 28:12 opens with, mortal raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre. So the question I leave it with from the Christian perspective is that could these prophets be speaking to the moment that they're in, Babylon and the king of Tyre, but also be delivering an image of this transformation from the earthly realm to the spiritual realm, to this idea that these kings are under the authority of the Lord of this world, who is the devil, and give us an example of how we tend to understand where the devil comes from. And I'm going to skip over the long text and just go to this one, which includes a bit of Isaiah 14:3, which we've already read, how you've fallen from heaven, and the text from Luke 10, verse 17 through 19. The 70 turned with joy, saying, Lord, in your name even the demons submit to us. He said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning. See, I have given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. So, obviously, that reference to I saw Satan fall from heaven fits quite well with the Christian understanding of the story of Lucifer, which is that Daystar, son of dawn, who is cast down from the heights of the clouds into the place of Sheol and far reaches of the pit. This is a redrawn image from the 12th century, and within it, it's hard to see. It's a story of the creation of God and the angels. So this is God, though he's a good-looking God, it looks just like Jesus pretty much. But it's supposed to be the creation of the angels. And right under the creation of angels is this particular angel. And if you can make out that word there, you'll see the name given to it. And it is Lucifer. And the text of the scroll, well, up above, the text here, this is from a German text, but that's most likely in Latin, or it is in Latin. It says, Lucifer, you are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in the garden of God, yet inferior to God. All of that text comes from Ezekiel, chapter 28, verses 12b through 13a. And the scroll that is contained here, and see this image of Lucifer has an orb and a staff. What's that a symbol of? Authority, power, right? So, and I read again about this, that the wings of this Lucifer are above the other angels, which show a place of great authority given to this character. And the scroll says, you are the anointed cherub, extensive and shielding, and I placed you on the holy mountain of God. If you read Ezekiel 28, which was the other text I was going to have us read, but I don't want to take up all of our time, it's hard to read it and think he's writing about the king of Tyre, because it seems to be talking about something deeper than the king of Tyre. And obviously the early church picked it up and drew this drawing. So what happens to this Lucifer? Well, the next part of the text, which is, this is from the original text, is a symbol of Lucifer giving up his orb and his title. His wings are beginning to fall. Notice how even in black and white you can tell the color that's coming on to the wings there at the bottom. And then the bottom section, this is Lucifer in the middle. This is St. Michael the Archangel. And this is that image of Lucifer falling, being cast down. And all of this, and the text that go with this, I think I have one. Yeah, it's the scroll that's up here. It says, I will surely ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of heaven. I will sit on the mountain of the assembly on the heights of Zephon. I will surely ascend above the highest clouds. I will make myself like to the Most High. That scroll carries the text of Isaiah 14. So again, another image of the church reading the Old Testament now, again, hundreds of years later, and beginning to read into it the prophecy. And, all of us during Holy Week are going to be reading the Suffering Servant of Isaiah, which is read by Christians as talking about Jesus. So it's not completely that weird to think that early Christians would read this and see this story from Ezekiel the prophet and from Isaiah the prophet as a story of this day star who will be the name of Lucifer, who will be cast down, who Jesus will say, I saw Satan falling from the sky like a flash of lightning. Another image, this is from William Blake's drawings of the angels being cast down. And remember again, where does the story of angels first emerge being cast down to us? Comes from that reading of 1 Enoch. We're going to be way over time, and I apologize. Oh, this was very important. I always like to remind people that there can be absolutely no doubt after the reading of the Gospels that to Jesus, Satan and the devil is a real supernatural entity at work in the world for the purpose of evil, temptation, and destruction. The point is simply to make it clear. If Jesus believes in angels, Jesus definitely believes in evil spirits and in Satan, because he references Satan way too many times.
Well, okay, but you said the transformation went from it not being a proper noun to a proper noun. Well, that was mankind reporting it as the proper noun. So why couldn't it still be Jesus believing that Satan is the embodiment of evil, but not as its own separate entity?
Well, I think you could say both of those things. The rabbis will say that.
So you can say both of them.
Well, the rabbis will later say that even though in the Kabbalah and another text of mystical Judaism, they will have an image of Satan being more than just a personification of evil and a symbol. The rabbis will see it that way. At the time of Jesus and after Jesus, there's an understanding that there's a great battle going on. And I think you can believe both and about that. And maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense, and I have to think about it and argue it better for you. But the idea of Jesus, I think Jesus believed in a personification of evil in this spirit of Satan. And I think that's because he read the text and that the influence was there. And Jesus understood it in that way. And Jesus, again, if Jesus is also fully divine, then we have to give credit to that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the problem we have, and what we'll talk about next week in our final couple of sessions, is what do we make out of that? Because the danger of this is that Jesus believed that the devil was on the same level as God, versus some sort of spiritual tempter that's involved, some sort of rebellion. You know, the interesting thing is that I don't think I said this last week, but the rabbis in the time of Jesus did not accept 1 Enoch because they made this proclamation. Angels were created by God, so therefore they could not rebel against God. God doesn't create spiritual beings that have some sort of free will like we do. He made us to be in His image and gave us the opportunity of that. And you know, the writers of Enoch might say, well, you're missing the point. What do we do with Genesis chapter 6 and this story of angels wanting to come down and copulate with human women? I mean, I think, again, what I love about it all, honestly, is the struggle of seriousness they take the text. Not like fundamentalists who the Bible says, I believe that settles it, without asking questions about it. They're asking deep questions and trying to dig in. And they're trying to pick things up. And I think in a lot of ways, they're willing to say, we don't know about, we have text in Jude. We have Jesus referencing things. But as I said, there's not a New Testament or an Old Testament in Christian church that includes 1 Enoch. So I think even they understood that, again, because we're Christians and we understand the inspired Word of God, we have to deal with God's inspiration. And I think in a lot of ways, Christians are trying to make sense of evil the way we try to make sense of evil. And in their world, there was a spiritual realm that must have been engaging in tempting the world that it hated, because it includes humanity that's made in the shape of God and in the image of God, and has a love that God's willing to give everything for them. So that leads to this understanding of the spiritual coming in to take it on and to tempt it and to destroy it. Versus us in our modern age, where we tend to figure we're God and we can sort out evil in one way or the other without the spiritual. And to me, both of them can be extremes without some middle ground understanding. And the text is always there to dig into and try to pull it out. Yes, Gail?
If Jesus is pre-existent with God, why did we have to cram 36 hours of Holy Saturday, Good Friday? Why did we have to give him all of that to do then? He had all eternity to restore those people. He had all eternity to get Abraham out of Sheol or wherever he was.
Yeah. Why do we put it on to that moment of time?
Why can't we just believe Jesus was dead?
Well, because if he died, he's just a human. And he died and he's dead. And it's pointless. He wasn't what he said he was.
He didn't rise from the dead.
If he didn't rise from the dead, then we're wasting our time. But you just said, but if we can't accept that he just died. I mean, what he did in that time between the moment of death and the moment of resurrection. I mean, the early church, this is what Anselm and the early church would say, that there was this moment in which he had tricked the devil. You know, this idea that death had won the game. I mean, that would be the truth. If sin, if humanity has fallen away from God, sin has entered into their life, and the wages of sin, as Paul says, are death. Therefore, death is what we all face, and death is it. Then if God can come down into earth as Jesus and die on the cross, and death is it, then death wins the game. But the idea is that God never intended death in the beginning. So therefore, the devil thinks that the devil's won, and Jesus is taking that time frame to go in there and reset the world. I mean, that's what Paul will say later, is that you have Adam, who's the first human, and then you have Jesus, who's the new first human. The idea of Adam bringing death into the world, and Jesus gives the chance for death to be overthrown and destroyed. And that's the message of the Christian faith, in honesty. And the devil part of it is mixed in the midst of us trying to sort it all out in our brains. But I mean, is that what you wanted to know about as far as eternity for Abraham?
No, that's not true. Jesus, I was always taught that Jesus died just like everybody died.
Yes.
And he was dead.
Yes.
And it was
I got it. Sorry.
God's grace for mankind that Jesus arose from the dead.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, Gail. I understand what you're saying now. So the death is he needed to be dead for those days. And again, when the early church, when the Reformation happens, that's what we tend to think of Holy Saturday as now. The Greek Orthodox, the Orthodox Church, has an understanding of the harrowing of hell. Roman Catholicism does too, but they don't spend as much time with it as the Orthodox do. And for Protestants, Holy Saturday is if we read the prayers in the prayer book, because there is a prayer for Holy Saturday, it doesn't talk about Jesus going down and fighting a battle against the devil and knocking the door down to get out Abraham and all of them. It just talks about his death and in that moment of quiet in the world before Sunday morning comes. So, again, I'm not arguing for the harrowing of hell, more than simply saying, to me, it's a sign of the early church really trying to dig in and sort these things out. And they might have overly sorted them out, which means that none of us would say that the harrowing of hell is required for you to be a follower of Jesus. But it's an understanding that the early church dealt with. And I think it was important to talk about in this class because it's hell. And that idea that there is some place of punishment. Because what we won't get to today, but we'll talk about next week, is what the image of the book of Revelation tells us. Because Revelation will be the full development of the Christian idea about the devil and the devil's destruction. Because then at the end, it'll be the devil chained up and put back down into that place. So, yes. I see your hand and I talk.
Back to this.
Yeah.
When Jesus was born, it says in the Bible he was fully man and fully God.
Yeah.
So, okay. Because I have a problem with what's being said here is that in he, was crucified, died, and was buried.
Yeah.
And on the third day he rose again.
Yeah.
Okay, did his body die,
Yes.
but the spirit did not.
Well, the spirit is an interesting, yeah.
He's fully man and fully God when he's born.
Well, he was. And there's no problem with what you just said, nor what Gail laid out when I figured out what she was saying. But the idea is that he is fully God and fully man, right? Fully human. So therefore, to be fully human, he must go through every phase that we go through, which means he dies on the cross to go into death. And what he does within death is what we were talking about tonight. Whether he does nothing but rest in the tomb on Saturday, or whether, as the early church worried about, did he go down and preach to the dead? I mean, all of that would require some sort of beyond the body being in Jesus.
Well, and in the Nicene Creed, doesn't it say he descended into the dead?
No, that's what it says in the Apostles' Creed. In the Nicene Creed, it doesn't say that. But the Apostles' Creed is thought to be an older creed than the Nicene Creed, which again I think reflects that both of you are correct. I mean, it's the truth. Jesus dies, he has to be buried, and then he explodes and rises from the dead. But what happens in the in-between, we're only talking about today because the early church struggled with it. Did he just rest in the tomb for those extra days? Or did he do something else? I mean, he descended into the dead is what the Apostles' Creed says, but the Nicene doesn't say it. So again, I think the interesting thing we always have to come to terms with in faith is that it's faith. And so all we have is the Bible to go on. And so that's why I wanted to show you those passages from 1 Peter. Because 1 Peter shows that the early church seemed to have asked the same questions and came to the idea that he must have gone down and preached the gospel to the dead. Because what else was he going to do? He wouldn't just sit around. He'd want to go out and do something, right? So, I mean, I think it's definitely, there's nothing wrong with either of those. It would be wrong if the resurrection didn't happen, from my perspective, not the others. Yes, Jim Lee.
I'd like to say that for the heroin and hell, that makes sense to me because it's a theological development that is being made of, okay, Abraham, we're the seed of Abraham. Moses is a spiritual leader. All of these things. What happened to them before Jesus came and resurrected, and we know that we're now going to heaven because the Jews did not have a full understanding at all of heaven. They went to the bosom of Abraham.
Yeah, there you go.
They're just there in a holding pattern.
Yeah.
So it really makes sense to me from a theological perspective that he did do that, and it was their way of attaching those two covenants, the old covenant. And the other thing about the fully man and fully God, and we were talking about this at the end of Bible study. He was fully God and fully man, but the scripture that says he gave up his Godhead, which means he was not acting on earth, but he was fully man as God. He was giving up the privilege of that power, taking on the full privilege of mankind, and as much tempted as we are, to where he could even say, when they asked him when the end times were coming, I don't know, he said. Only my Father in heaven knows. He was that identified with us. So,
But he also performed miracles.
Yeah, that's right.
But he says, you will perform miracles too when I go. So, what I think he was trying to show us is we could be much more than we are if we got ourselves out of the way and let God actually truly work.
And this would be a key piece of discussion amongst the early church. When we get to the year 1000 or so, we have the first great schism between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. The Eastern churches were always a lot more on the God's divinity side. They were the same way. God is fully human, fully divine. But their understanding was his divinity was too great for him to be just walking around like a regular old slug on the side of the road, So their sense of it was that there was more godliness in it. The Western church really wanted, like all of us, tend to reflect that he wanted to be fully human so he could save us from our humanness. So therefore the humanness is equally important. Neither sides of those churches are saying that he wasn't fully human or he wasn't fully divine. But it's the struggle, and it shows how thousands and thousands of people all around the world try to sort out the meaning of their faith. And I think the important part of it is that they dig into it. And the purpose of all of these classes is to show that faith is so important. For 2,000 years, we've dug deep into it to try to find answers to the hard questions. And sometimes the hard questions aren't easy to answer. And we land on this topic of evil, as Jeannie said. Is the devil personification of evil? Or is the devil its own character? Is Satan really a being that has a whole slew of demons underneath him and he's sending them up to attack us? I mean, all of this is a sign of Christianity trying to sort out what our life is like with one foot on earth and one foot in the heavenly realm. How do we make sense of that? And all we have are the Scripture and all these theologians who tried to sort it out and left information behind. Some better than others. Some's like First Enoch, really interesting to read, but there's a reason why it's not in the Bible. And some stuff that is just at best, or is a really good understanding and description, which is why the Herald of Hell holds on. I think it's something that seems to make sense to the early church to deal with the fact that there was a time before Jesus. And it's easy for us in the 21st century to say, well, God took care of Abraham, we don't need to worry about it. Because we're better about that now. They didn't talk that way 2,000 years ago. They were thinking about death and dying because it was happening all around them. They were seeing things happening that we don't even pay attention to anymore. And they were reading into it in ways that we tend to read about other things today. And that's why they dig into it scripturally and try to sort it out. And it's an interesting discussion in our faith, whether or not he rested on that day or whether or not he descended into hell and went into battle, as I said. Yes, Rula. What's that?
To me, it makes complete sense that he went into hell. But his body was just like we died. And our body is dead, but our spirit is not.
Yeah.
So his spirit could go down there.
That's right.
By
Yeah.
his death.
See, this all is going to lead to my Easter class on the Shroud of Turin, which is an amazing place of the meeting of both of those things. What happens if you have a nuclear explosion that leaves a tiny little fragment of an image, or was it just painted in the 12th century? You all can figure that out, but there's something amazing happening within that process. And I think the important part is the death that Gail talked about, but also the power and divinity that we're all thinking about in this way of fully human, fully divine God. Let's take a break there, and we'll pick it back up next week, and I'll get through Paul and the Revelation, and then I'll see how much time I got for the Middle Ages. Nobody, what do we need to talk about the Middle Ages for? The Middle Ages, they've come and gone. Left us some good art. But there we go. So, thank you all, and thanks Doug and your crew on a fine dinner tonight. Thank you.